When Sunday night comes along, you get that feeling in the pit of your stomach? Are you almost sick, thinking, oh no, another school day? My child is going to have to go through another day of frustration, questioning. Is school sometimes difficult for your children? Are there answers? Are there any answers? Is there a way out? My name is Vin Daquino. There is a way out. Today it's called Elaine Mellon. What a pleasure. Let's talk writing, Elaine.
Thank you.
You wrote a book. It's called unREAL Education Beyond the Report Card. And it comes from an experience, a long experience with your own child.
Yes.
Tell us about this journey.
Well, the journey started pretty much soon after my son was born, that I realized that there was a little difference between he and his sisters, but different in a way that I couldn't quite figure out until he got to school. And he has two older sisters, and they tell you, you really shouldn't compare your kids. But I knew early on, my oldest was reading before she was ever in kindergarten. My middle one was reading in kindergarten. And by second grade, my son couldn't even spell his name. And that started it. We had the school district test him in second grade, and our unREAL journey began.
Now, that was school. And there were problems in school, but what about the rest of his life? Was this a kid who was able to function day by day and other things?
Absolutely.
I mean, he played normally, he had friends?
Absolutely. He was wise beyond his years. He was riding a two-wheeler at 2 years old. He loved to pull things apart and put them back together. His favorite game was the memory concentration game where you would put everything. Nobody can beat him, even in an early age.
Wow.
And he just couldn't function in school.
And so you did this famous, not a battle, but discovery of who this child is and what this child would need to perform to be a special kind of normal.
Correct.
So tell me about this special kind of normal. Did it involve medication?
No. We tested him in second grade, and they told me he was learning disabled with processing issues. So they put him in some special education classes, and he had a little bit of remedial reading in the beginning. He was working with the school psychologist in the beginning. They had said to me, well, on one of his IEPs, which is a big conversation that I have in the book about IEPs, that, one of the letters said to me, well, maybe he's ADHD, we should have him seen by a neurologist. We did have him seen by a neurologist, and I talk a lot about him in the book because he single-handedly saved my sanity.
Wow.
And what the neurologist said to me, and again, this isn't true for all children, it was for my son,
right,
that is he showing signs and symptoms of ADHD? He was about 8 or 10 years old at the time. Absolutely. But what he said to me was just about every 8 to 10-year-old boy that he sees does that. He's a very active 10-year-old boy, and that was much different than ADHD, which turned out not to be his issue, but we didn't know that until almost 7 years later.
And that's part of the problem. By the time they weed out everything else, years are passing, and there's windows. Thing that always drove me nuts about school is if you're 8 years old, you belong in this grade. If you're 9, you belong in this grade. 10, this grade. And if you don't meet the window when the window's open, you're either failing, you're a failure because you don't meet their standards. And I was a school teacher for 35 years. I've dealt with so many different kinds of children, and it drives you crazy.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because I wrote it to help support and empower other parents that were going through the special education system, because that is rule number one. You think you're going nuts because you are seeing something in your children that everybody else says to you, no, 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 no. Yeah. And I really wrote that to trust your gut, and really you need to keep focusing on things. And one of the other topics that the neurologist had brought up to me, he said, what most important, you need to focus on their strengths, not their weaknesses.
Right.
And even more so, and I guess this is what really saved my sanity, was he said to me that if you focus on his strengths, that's going to get him through school. But most importantly, you need to focus on his self-esteem. And if you keep his self-esteem intact, it'll trump everything else.
Yep.
And he was 100% correct.
Yep. And that is what happens. I mean, for years, our education system was the factory system. Kids go through the assembly line. If at that certain point they're not up to standards, off the belt. Go in that room. Go in that room. And they just threw them off the assembly line. And that's what it was. It was an assembly line going, you know, if today is June 1st, we're on page 139. And I've watched that my whole life as a teacher, you know, and it's hard because there's so many children going through at once that it's very difficult to be able to focus on each child individually when you have 28 or 30 in the class. And children are so different in so many different ways, but you have to respect their differences. And you have to help a child realize you're not different, you're unique. And you have to deal with that uniqueness. And the child has to understand that. I've watched my son, I've watched my grandson get beaten down, come up with wonderful ideas that people didn't get. You're looking at one right here. I went through school where teachers said to me, no, that's not right. And I walk away saying, yes, it is. And it took years to realize that there are a lot of different ways to think out of the box. And unfortunately, sometimes school is very much in the box. So you have to see it. And you have to do it without getting angry. You have to do it without attacking the teachers. And it's very hard to do.
Yes.
I mean, there are times when I want to go through the ceiling, even when I went through. My guidance counselor said to me in high school, don't become a teacher. It's not your thing. With all due respect, he said, you should go to work in the factories. I grew up in Utica, New York. There were factories everywhere. He said, you'd make a wonderful foreman. That's what you should do. And I said, nope, I'm going to be a teacher. And I fought him. And in a sense, he was wonderful for me because I fought to be everything against what he was saying. And in that way, I was able to achieve what I wanted to achieve.
Well, that was one of the reasons why I said in here, you know, in the topic, I said, you know, 19 years in the making of how one boy's academic struggles led to his success, because I truly believe that all the struggles that he went through and all the negatives he went through made him who he is today. Though it would have been nice if it was a little bit easier along the way, because it was definitely hard.
We have learned in history that many of the successes, the people that we celebrate the most, have been beaten down the most. They're people who had to face incredible adversity. And they've had to fight and fight and fight. And you know what fighting does? Makes you tougher. It does. And it's a shame because neither of us want to see our children struggle.
Right.
I've been in so much pain for them. And you can't take that pain. You just can't pull it away and say, you know what? Today you're going to have a wonderful day because I'm going to suffer for you. It doesn't happen. You can suffer with them, but you can't suffer instead of them. So you have to find ways to make their life easier. And you do have to fight.
Oh,
and
you
you
do.
can't just
You do.
accept everything that a teacher or an administrator or a psychologist or psychiatrist says. And you have to use your own common sense in seeing some of these things.
Well, one of the things that is a consistent theme throughout the book is it's okay to question. You're the parent.
Yes.
And if something doesn't make sense to what the homework is, or why are we doing this test, or why did you say this on his paper, that you can question. And if you don't like the answer, you can continue to question. And unfortunately, when we were kids, we were brought up with, you know, what the teacher says is always right, and you don't question the teacher. That has to change. And I understand that teachers have an absolute horrible, not horrible, but a real tough job dealing with all those different students in the class. But some of what happens within the school district really has nothing to do with whether a child is disabled or not. It has to deal with how the district handles things. And I actually have an example in the book. When my son was in 10th grade, they were reading Julius Caesar. And he came home with the worksheet, which I actually put in the book. And I looked at the worksheet, and I'm looking over his shoulder like I always did when we did his, when he did his homework. And I took the sheet and I said, "You're not doing this homework assignment." And he looked at me very puzzled, and I went to my drawer and I pulled out my red pen. Now, this was a worksheet that came from the publisher to the school, to all the 10th graders, learning disabled or not,
All the 10th
okay,
graders.
they've been using for years, and there were grammatical errors, spelling errors on the worksheet. And I said, if my son was to hand in a paper like that to you, you would take off points. Now, this had nothing to do with the disability. This is a very simple thing within the school district. I circled everything in red, sent it back to the teacher, the head department, everybody that I knew, and I pretty much said, "How dare you send this home?" Now, what it should have happened is it should have been used as a teaching tool in the classroom. They should have corrected all of those in the classroom, and then it would have made sense. So some of it really has nothing to do, it just made it worse because he was dyslexic, which is what we ended up finding out.
Right.
So,
that's a very important point. That misdiagnosis is a lot more common than you think.
oh, it's very common.
It's so easy to label. And unfortunately, labeling makes life easier. Not better, easier. So some kids just get sucked into that. And there's kids who end up in the back. I mean, I was an average student. The chances of my ever becoming a writer or a teacher were zero. Zero. Teachers would have bet their houses that it would never happen. 9 books later, and 35 years later, of hundreds and hundreds of kids that I've been working with, they were wrong. So now I have the advantage of saying, nah, I told you so. Did that make my life easier? No. I did it in spite of it. But there are kids who are not like me. There are kids who, when you smack them, they stay down. They don't get up and fight again. I was a fighter. So what are we going to do for those children who can't get up and fight and whose parents can't get up and fight? There's so many people who just say, if the school saying it must be true. Not always true. And I'll be the last one to fault the schools because it was not easy teaching. There are so many things you have to know. You have to look out there and you can't see 28 children. You have to see 28 individuals, different needs, and understand where these kids are coming from. Some of these kids are coming into school after watching their parents fight all night long, or sitting next to a dying grandmother, or fighting poverty, or fighting the fact that their house was just taken away by a hurricane or a tornado. So many things, so many factors make a whole child. And to be able to stand in front of a room and see 28 whole children for all of their goods and all of their bads is a tough job.
well, I also found that for a lot of the teachers, they were caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yes.
And oftentimes it wasn't the teacher, it was the administration, and you have a program that's set up with IEPs, and I do believe it's impossible for a teacher to know all 30 children if half of them have IEPs, but
Let me
is the
interrupt you
process
for a
in place.
second. Individual educational program.
Correct.
An IEP is what they give to a child who is having difficulty, and they say, okay, we'll write you a separate program. And your separate program is called your IEP. So you get that separate little program, and they design it for that child. So I'm sorry, so go ahead.
That's okay. Well, the problem is, and again, I write about the IEPs in the book, is that the individual, it's really not an individual education plan. A lot of it is taken down from a drop-down menu, though there is a little space where some of the teachers can, write some of their own.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to do. And rule number 1 on the IEP is that the goals and objectives need to be specific and measurable. And if that's not done, the whole system falls apart. And we had a lot of those issues in here.
And it's what we said before. What they do is they take you out of this box, or they take you off of this conveyor belt, and they put you on that conveyor belt.
Correct.
And you just go to a different assembly line.
Right.
And it may be a smaller assembly line, but it's still an assembly line.
Well, we didn't find out. When my son was doing horrible in a class, they would put him into a lower level class. And what we found out later was that was absolutely the wrong thing to be doing. And he wasn't properly diagnosed until 9th grade, when we actually took him to a hospital in the city to have him properly diagnosed. I pulled him out of the school district to be tested, and he was in 9th grade reading at a 4th or 5th grade level. But he had gotten through all those years at school because he was personable and he was smart and he got things from his class. So he was just barely passing.
Yep.
And if you're barely passing, they're going to put you through.
I remember once when I angered a teacher, when the teacher said, look, here is the diagnostic tool that proves where this child is. And I said, you want to do me a favor? Instead of giving the diagnostic tool to the child, give another diagnostic tool to your diagnostic tool. And show me where this tool is going to measure what you're saying is wrong with this child. How will this pinpoint what this child is having difficulty with? And a lot of times the standardized tests are standard.
Right.
And your child isn't. This is a unique child. And a lot of times it just doesn't test it.
Right.
You know, I have a lot of trouble with, you know, IQ tests and things that put you at number 123 or, you know, I just have trouble with some of those.
Well, one of the things that the neurologist that I spoke about earlier, what he also said to me is he rattled off, I call my son Blake in the book, when he rattled off all these wonderful attributes that Blake had. And, you know, he was personable, he was athletic, and he was only like 8 or 10 years old, and all these wonderful attributes. And he said, unfortunately, all of these attributes that he's really good at, he said, are not what they emphasize in school.
Right.
So he said, however, all these attributes that he's good at is what's going to make him successful in life.
Yep.
And again, he was right.
How would you like a child who is a questioning child, who is bright, who is active, who is energetic? Put that child in a classroom that has rows of seats and a teacher who firmly believes this, in order for these other children to learn, there must be quiet and you must be able to follow the curriculum as it's written. That child, all those attributes are now negatives because that child is going to question everything you teach. Now, is it annoying as a teacher to have a kid who has his hand up all day long? Absolutely.
He was actually told he asked too many questions.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine telling a child, you're too inquisitive? Isn't that what it's supposed to be? Aren't teachers supposed to be teaching how to ask questions, not give answers? Do I want my children to answer my questions or learn how to make questions of their own?
But we didn't find, it wasn't until he went to college. Now, the book covers 19 years. It covers from when he's born up through his freshman year in college. And we didn't really find out why some things didn't work until he got to college. And one of those key factors was, at least in our district, and I know a lot of districts from parents that I spoke to, they organized the kids, which worked for my older two. You know, they have the same color notebook with the same color folder with the same color book cover. Wonderful. For my son, that didn't work. And we didn't realize until later, because in high school you'd have 5 or 6 teachers in a day, all telling you 5 or 6 different ways to keep things organized. It was too much.
When did you write this book?
I wrote it, it came out last summer. It took me about 3.5 years to write. And I didn't know when I was writing that I was actually writing a book.
When did you do most of your writing? What time of the day?
It wasn't any specific time of day. It was.
Oh, that's wrong, you know.
It was. I don't follow the rules. It kind of goes.
I mean, can you imagine if you told a writer, "Oh no, you can't write between 7 and 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
That's not a good time to write."
Yeah.
For you.
Yeah.
Not for me.
Well, when I started to write because I was really angry. We had actually sued the school district and lost for very illegal reasons. And we had all kinds of documentation and everything else. And I didn't know what to do with that anger. And I just started to write. And then about a year later, somebody had said to me, a friend of mine had said to me, you know, I think really this would help other people. So my first draft of the book had names, dates, places, everything. As I started to write more, I realized the purpose of the story is to help other parents, as well as some vindication for my son to let him know how proud we were of him. And that's how it turned into a book. And I finished writing the book when he graduated high school, because he got into all these really wonderful schools. And I think he got in because of the essay that he wrote, and which I put in the book. The essay, they always ask that one question, what is about your education that can explain your grades? And he wrote about the dyslexia, and the entire thing is spelled wrong. And that's how we sent it to the colleges.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And he got in.
And he got in, and then we had some really fantastic stories about his freshman year in college that I had to add, because it was the icing on the cake, that there really was this light at the end of the tunnel. And in spite of all this, things can really work themselves out.
How do you approach the schools without ticking them off and becoming an enemy of the school?
Unfortunately, because of the way the school system is set up, as soon as you start to question, it becomes adversarial. I mean, you can be the really nice and polite parent, which we were for 7 years.
Yeah, I tried every angle.
You jump through hoops, you do everything that you're told, and really everybody's just kind of, you know, it's hit or miss. You're trying because you don't know what it is. And part of the reason why I have the puzzle on the cover of the book is because I kept going back to them and saying, we're missing a piece to the puzzle. You're all telling me he's verbal in class and he answers questions and he participates, but he's failing his tests.
I know, I'm
What's
going through
going
the
on?
same thing.
Yeah.
The child's bright, the child has potential, but he belongs in special ed. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean he belongs in a subtext of what you normally do? So is it the child that's a problem, or is it the curriculum that's the problem?
Right.
Is it your norm that isn't really normal at all? So is it the child's fault? What do we do to bring this child up? And remember, every time you do that, you're telling the child you're not as good as everybody else. Failure. I mean, when I was in school, you did well or you failed. That word is a 4-letter word, and especially to a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old who watches all of the other students go on to the next grade, and he doesn't. Considered a failure. What's failing, the system or the child?
Well, I took the neurologist's advice to heart, where he said focus on his strengths. And I can't tell you how many times I took flack from the school. I mean, they really thought I was the problem, because I was like, you know what? He needs to go to basketball practice today. He can't go to biology extra help. He'll work on it with a biology tutor. He needs to go to basketball practice, because basketball is what's keeping him in school.
That gets you in trouble.
It got me in a lot of trouble. But I really felt like I was doing the right thing for him.
I know. I know so many times in my life, from childhood to today, people have said, you're wrong. My books, even my books. Some of the people say, no, you wrote that? It's all right. You know, and there's always someone ready to tell you that you're wrong. And when you turn to them and say, what are you basing that on? You? Where's your book? Did you write one? Mine's wrong. Where's yours? And they don't get it.
You talked about the standardized tests before. My son didn't even take some of those tests, because I said there was absolutely no reason for you to go in and take them. And now what they're doing with the standardized tests is totally wrong. They're using it to rate the teachers, which I think is a horrible thing for the teachers. But to me, those standardized tests were originally supposed to help them find the students that were falling behind. And even a bad teacher knows what students are not doing well in their class.
But then you understand the other side. Now, I taught for all those years, worked with those kids. Now, you're hearing me saying all these things, and I'm telling you, I was on the other side. Then why didn't I fix it? Because it's not an easy fix.
It's not an easy fix.
It's very difficult. When you have 900 kids in the 6th grade, what are you going to do with all those 900 kids? What program could possibly answer to the needs of every one of them as individuals?
Well, I've spoken to a couple of professors at a couple of colleges, because I'm actually trying to get my book into some teacher training programs. One, because it covers 19 years, so it's like a mini case study.
Yeah.
And my problem with the teacher education is that I really don't feel that after a teacher comes out with 1 semester of student teaching, they're ready to start teaching. I think there should be more teacher training. I think the teachers should get paid more, because which is a big issue also. But I think they need more training than they
go to
get
college
before they come into the classroom.
$25,000 to $35,000 a year to come out and get a job for $30,000 a year, and they owe more than they paid to go to school.
Yeah.
It's difficult. Here's the question. Get some real solid answers out of this book, or what?
Absolutely. No matter what grade your child is in, from kindergarten, from pre-K up through college, there's something in there for everybody. I wrote it chronologically. I'm not a writer. I really never liked to write, and so I wrote it in large print, short chapters, easy to read, easy to pick up, a lot of answers, and some resources too in the book.
So if you have a child doing poorly or doing well, you should read this book.
Absolutely. I also want to let people know that I'm donating a portion of the proceeds back to 2 wonderful organizations, the International Dyslexia Association and Everyone Reading New York.
All right. Can you, I'm sorry, say that again? What is the name of the organization you're donating some of the proceeds from this book to?
Yes. The first one is the International Dyslexia Association.
International Dyslexia Association.
And Everyone Reading, which is in New York.
Everyone Reading, which is where, New York?
In New York, yeah.
Now, that's an organization that tries to get as many people reading as possible?
They're actually, the Everyone Reading used to be part of the International Dyslexia Association, and now they went out on their own. So it's a separate organization.
So, a bottom line advice for parents.
Trust your gut. If you're seeing something at home, they may not be seeing it at school. You can't worry about if you're going to be...
It's a partnership.
If you can't worry about the school being upset about you questioning, and if your child is upset about something in school, it might have to go back to the fact that they're just really not able to...
And your job as a parent isn't to attack the schools. It's to find a solution together.
Correct.
Teamwork.
Correct.
That child belongs to both of you, the school and home. And it's that combination that's going to make the whole child.
Correct.
We have to see and understand where the kid is coming from.
Correct.
He's not just a brick in the wall, as Pink Floyd would say. Well, you've heard it here. Now read it here. Your child is your responsibility. Is it just the school's responsibility? No, yours too. It's a partnership. Read this book. And stay tuned to this show for other authors. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining in on Let's Talk Writing.